Hello everyone and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to remove the transmission assembly from your Honda HR215 Master Series lawnmowers to either service or replace the transmission. Now on this particular unit, it is a hydrostatic drive unit and the seals on them are leaking, as well as the fluid hasn't been changed in it in over 20 years. Now before we work on this lawnmower, what we want to do is shut the fuel supply off and then start up the mower to let it burn off any fuel that's inside the carburetor. Let it run until the fuel runs out. Take a 14mm impact gun and undo the two rear wheels. Make note of any of the small washers and ratchets on the axle. Remove the pin and the large washer. Repeat the same for the other side. Using a long extension and an 8mm socket, undo the transmission top access cover and undo this single bolt. Note that there is a washer on this bolt. Undo the cable assembly from the transmission cover by taking the screwdriver and carefully prying the ratchet clip open. With the area cleaned up, we need to now remove this CV axle drive shaft from the transmission. And you can actually feel around for this snap ring here because it's covered a bit in oil. But we're going to squeeze that with a pair of pliers and just undo that clip, which then exposes us to a pin that can be pushed out, and then this half shaft can be slid off of the transmission drive input shaft. With that snap ring out of the way, we can take a little poker tool and just push this little pin through the shaft. So with a few gentle taps with a screwdriver, I was able to push this retaining pin through the bore and remove it. The axle should then be able to pull away from the transmission, and just make sure that you don't lose this retaining ring, which covers that little pin inside of this input shaft. All right, next up is the transmission drive engagement cable. So to remove that, we're going to manually use our hand and pull up on this lever, and then very carefully pull up on the housing to remove it from the retaining bracket, and then letting it go, and then just kind of fishing it out of the retaining slot, like so. Just like that. I've tipped the mower over onto its right-hand side, which is really important. So the air cleaner on the motor has to be upright so that you don't dump out engine oil all over the shop floor. But the final steps in removing the transmission assembly from the mower is to undo the side adjusters on the back side of the mower, which is also the, the height adjusters is also the carriage assembly that passes through the drive shaft on each side. So in order to do this, you have to tip the mower up on each side or prop it up. And you're going to use a 12mm wrench to hold the nut underneath, and then a 14mm size ratchet on the top, or the socket, to undo that. Now make note of all the parts that come off in the order so that you don't mix them up for reassembly. You'll notice here that the bolt removed actually is a shouldered bolt, which passes through our adjuster here, and then through the chassis, and then through the bolt. Now it's a good time to also inspect the height adjuster bushing, which is right here. Now, because this is a premium residential model, that this is actually a ball bearing in here, and so I can feel there's a little bit of play here, so I might end up ordering some replacements. We'll have to see, because I noticed that when I'm rolling with the mower that it does make a bit of a squeak, and that's because the ball bearings are likely starting to wear and rust out. Okay, so this is the transmission out of the mower. Once I undid the height adjusters / carriage assemblies from the left and right side of the mower, that this entire assembly just kind of fell out once I unhooked this little piece right here from this little rail, guide rail inside of the mower housing. Now, using a 10mm socket, I'm going to undo this bolt and this bolt to remove this sort of deflector shield, and then clean up the transmission. And then at that point, we will be able to drain the fluid and assess the overall condition of the transmission, as well as replacing the axle seals that have developed a leak. So I'm just using a stiff brush here, and I'm just knocking off all this crud, and then using a vacuum cleaner to suck up all the dirt. Continue to thoroughly clean the exterior of the transmission housing to ensure that no dirt makes its way into the fluid circuit during the fluid change procedure. If you do not plan to change the axle seals, please skip over to the fluid draining procedure at the 13-minute marker. Okay, so I've cleaned off the majority of the dirt on my hydrostat transmission, and I guess the transmission, looking from, I guess if you'd be standing behind the mower, this is the right seal, and there's not really a lot of oil residue on it. But if you look on the left side here, that there's a ton of dirt that's still stuck to that seal. And so we're going to use some brake cleaner and blast off all of this crap that's embedded in that seal area, just because when I pull that seal out, I don't want any dirt getting into this transmission. We'll do the same for the right side since I bought a set of them. And you'll notice that I said to drain the hydrostat fluid out of this fill plug / dipstick, but I'm not going to do that yet, only because I want this to be filled with some fluid so that when I pull out that dirty seal, that the oil inside will also flush out the crap that fell into that bore. All right, so I've used a toothbrush and brake cleaner on both seals of the transmission. Now the next step here is to, I guess, refurbish the drive shaft and make it as smooth as possible, because there's a small layer of corrosion on here, using the least aggressive method possible. So what I've got here is a wire wheel on a brush, or sorry, a wire wheel on a drill, I should say. And I'm just gonna run it up and down the shaft to remove all the dirt and corrosion. All right, folks, so I spent probably a good half an hour with that wire wheel brush, and I've essentially polished the drive shafts to a mirror smooth finish. So here are the two replacement oil seals for our hydrostatic transmission. They are both the same seal for the left and right side of the transmission, and it is a genuine Honda part from your local Honda power equipment dealer. The part number is 91201246005. They are made in Japan, and for a good while, Honda Canada was actually back ordered on these for about a month and a half. So make sure that you call your dealer prior to doing any service work on your power equipment, because a lot of these parts can be back ordered for quite some time. Now these seals are made out of a special, I think it's a nitrile rubber, but it's an automotive grade seal with a tension spring. I'm just taking a flat bladed screwdriver, like a miniature one. I'm just going to stick it in between the hardened shaft and the seal lip, and then just very carefully pry up. And just moving around. To get the seal to come out. That took no time to remove. Now you need to be careful though, that you don't want to get too aggressive and scratch the shaft really badly or the bore, because then you're going to end up with a leak. So holding the transmission upside down like this, I shot up into that bore with some brake cleaner just to remove any dust and debris, and then I've done a very close inspection of the bore and the shaft to make sure that there's no physical damage. And then while it was still turned upside down, I continued to rotate the hydrostat transmission's axle by hand, and then you can kind of see here that a little bit of hydrostat fluid started seeping out, which is expected because there's that little hole there to allow oil to get into that seal to lubricate it. So, and that's okay. We're going to now install our new seal by coating it with some new hydrostatic fluid, very much like how you do it on an engine reassembly, and then we're just going to carefully use our fingers to push that seal into place. Okay, so you can see here that that seal is slid on, and you got to make sure that you're very gentle with these seals, because on the back side there's that spring, and you want to make sure that that stays on that seal, because that's what is the clamping force around the shaft to prevent it from leaking. So we're going to move this shaft carefully down, and then we're essentially just going to use our hands and press it evenly until this seal is essentially flush or just slightly below that of the transmission body. So as I was trying to push the seal in by hand as best as I could, that I found that towards the very end that one side of the seal would keep kind of popping up. So unfortunately, I don't have a seal installer that will be wide enough to accommodate going down this relatively long shaft. So I just used a socket extension and just a soft mallet to tap that seal in, just going round and round evenly as possible to get that seal to go in. I managed to hand press that seal into sort of the transmission bore, and then initially I got it flush, and I said this should be flush with the transmission body, but that's actually a bit of a lie. I was mistaken, because if you look on the other side, it's a little bit recessed down into the transmission, and if you look very carefully, you can see that there is a sort of tapered cut at the entry of the bore, and then it's straight cut, and that seal sits maybe a millimeter or two below sort of that tapered cut on that opening. And so I had to somehow, without a seal driver, do the same for this side. And the problem is that you could use a screwdriver, because I've done it before, where you can just kind of gently tap around the seal to get it to go down into the bore. But I'm finding that rather than chewing up the edge of the seal, that if you pried out the old seal carefully enough, you can actually put the old seal back onto the shaft as how it came out, and then use the end of a ratchet extension and tap the old seal all around, which will then drive the new seal down further into the bore without actually marring the surface of the new seal. And then when this edge is uniform, okay, and don't go too far, tap a little bit, lift up and inspect, and keep doing that until you're happy with the depth of that seal. Repeat the same for the other side. Next, we're going to take a container and we're going to open up the dipstick fill plug for the transmission and pour out all the old transmission fluid. It's pretty incredulous how Honda says that this fluid normally doesn't need to be serviced. This mower, I believe, was manufactured in 2003, maybe 2004. I bought it used and it was running all right. But in more recent years, I found that the hydrostat was a little bit laggy and not as smooth or as fast. And I suspect it's because it was leaking a little bit of oil in more recent years, so the fluid may have been a bit low. But this fluid is supposed to be water clear. It's all really quite watery. It doesn't smell actually, but it is really dirty. I am using a 2-ounce syringe to fill the transmission up with new hydrostat fluid. I strongly recommend that the initial fill after the draining of all the fluid should be at least 8 ounces, as this transmission typically requires anywhere between 8 and 11 ounces of fluid or so, and it won't operate properly unless there is sufficient amount of oil in the tranny. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a service shop hack here. I've locked the drive engagement lever using the little clamp on the arm of the transmission, and I've attached my drill chuck to the input shaft, and I rotate in a clockwise only direction at a low RPM for 20 to 30 seconds to circulate the newly installed fluid through the transmission to flush out the old fluid. When we're done this, open up the drain cap, or the filler cap in this case, dump the fluid, and then put new fluid in and repeat. Alright, so I have refilled the transmission yet again for the second time, and I guess this would be the third time draining it out.
Looking at the fluid in the bucket here, that is the first and second, I guess, drain, and the fluid is really dark. But this third time draining it out, that the fluid now is a bit cloudy, a bit dirty, but overall it's not too bad. And this will be the last time I'm draining it out because the cost of hydrostat fluid here in Canada is quite cost prohibitive. So once everything is done draining out, I'm going to refill it with about 8 to 8.5 ounces of fluid.
All right, guys. So, interesting fact. This transmission, when it's fully emptied out, actually takes about 8.5 ounces to get the oil to the lower mark on the dipstick. Okay, so right now this transmission is mostly level. It's not quite the right way to measure fluid, but you have to have a starting baseline. And so this dipstick on that lower, thinner part, the bottom, would be on the low mark, and then when you're up here, like in this region before it gets thick, is the full mark. And so I put in just a hair, about 9.25 ounces of hydrostat fluid so far. All right, so I kept adding transmission fluid to the hydrostat tranny and came to about 9.5 ounces, where it shows on the upper level of that dipstick that we had shown you earlier. Now the next step is to actually bleed air out of the transmission. And so what we need to do, depending on the transmission style you have, is that we have to use a wire or a clamp to fully open up our flow control valve. I'm just using a clamp here because mine's a spring style, but if yours has a screw, you basically need to tighten down that screw to fully open up that valve. And then using a 10mm ratchet, we're going to undo this bleeder bolt that's on the opposite end of the input shaft. So input shaft here, and then there's the bleeder bolt. We need to fully open this up. Now the service manual does say that there's an O-ring on here that you should replace. I unfortunately don't have one, and I found that you can actually reuse the Honda rubber O-rings without any issue. So unfortunately, that's what we're going to do here. And once we've removed this purge plug, so to speak, and then what the service manual states that we have to do is we need to rotate the input shaft 5 to 10 times until no air bubbles come out of this backside. And then we have to rotate the shorter drive shaft 2 to 3 times in a clockwise direction to also purge out that lower pump. So as I rotated that input shaft, a whole bunch of fluid came out of the backside. So I'm going to do the same here, rotate the output shaft clockwise 2 to 3 turns, and I expect more fluid to puke out. Then when no bubbles come out of this hole, then we know we have purged the transmission. We reinstall that purge bolt, double check our fluid level, and reinstall the transmission. We've reinstalled everything into the lawnmower, and we've also followed the transmission sort of speed adjustment test, where we put the wheels on the lowest setting, and then we put our speed control all the way forward, and then engage the drive handle, and making sure that that little mark there, if you guys can see it, that little notch on my little lever lines up with a little notch on the transmission body. So that's really important if you want to get the right speeds on your Honda mower.
The Honda Factory Service Manual recommends that after changing the transmission fluid and completing a bench bleed procedure, that the next step is to do what they call an operational bleed procedure, and that can be accomplished by setting the engine and transmission speeds to maximum and then operating the transmission with some type of loading. In this case, I am operating the drive control with me pulling backwards on the lawnmower while the mower is trying to move forward, effectively providing a load to the transmission. Repeat this for at least 6 times for 25 seconds per cycle. Stop the mower, park on a level surface, check and adjust fluid levels, and repeat as required.
Okay, so wipe the dipstick once, put it back in and screwed it all the way in. And then carefully lift it out. And as you can see, my fluid level is actually a little bit low. It's not actually registering on the dipstick very well at all, so that implies that it needs more fluid. There's a little bit there, but that's just because it's a trace amount from the threads on the tranny. So we'll add in 1/2 ounce at a time until we get the fluid to where my fingernail is or on the top part of that thin section of the dipstick. So as the transmission bleeds out, you can actually tell that the transmission has a lot more pull and power than it ever has using the new fluid. So there is a notable difference when you do a fluid change and bleed the system out properly. So as you guys can tell, that changing out the axle seals as well as flushing and changing out the hydrostatic fluid in your Honda's hydrostatic drive system on your lawnmower can be done fairly easily. It just takes a little bit of time and patience to make sure that you get out all the old fluid, flush the new fluid, and then refill it properly and bleed out the system properly. If you guys like this video, give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel, and thank you for watching.